You're listening to Rebel Justice, the podcast from The View magazine. When we think about justice, we think about it as an abstract, something that happens to someone else, somewhere else. But justice and the law regulate every aspect of our interactions with each other, with organisations, and with the government. We never think about it until it impacts our lives or those of someone close. Our guests are women with lived experience of the justice system, whether as victims or women who have committed crimes, people at the forefront of civic action who put their lives on the line to demand a better world. We ask them to share their insight into how we might repair a broken and harmful system with humanity and dignity. We also speak with people who are in the heart of the justice system, creating important change: judges, barristers, human rights campaigners, mental health advocates, artists, and healers. In today's episode, you're going to hear an extraordinary story of survival, resilience, and purpose. Our guest grew up in Northern Ireland during a time of political unrest, but alongside that wider conflict, she faced violence much closer to home. As a child, she lived with domestic abuse, experienced firsthand the failures in policing and safeguarding, and had to navigate a world where safety wasn't guaranteed. It's a story that's at times painful, but it's also one of hope, strength, and the power to transform lived experience into lasting change. After moving to Scotland, she went on to build a career dedicated to protecting others, from working in public health and harm reduction to research and policy that puts the voices of children and survivors at the centre. Janine Ewen has over 2 decades of experience championing trauma-informed care and addressing the harms and disadvantages faced by children, young people, and underserved communities, particularly in relation to organised crime and criminalisation. Since 2016, she's been an active member of the Global Law Enforcement and Public Health Association and a regular contributor to the Policing Insight and the Vulnerability and Policing Futures Research Centre, writing on themes such as public health, organised crime, and community well-being. Her published work includes practical insights for professionals as well as critical reflections drawn from lived experience. Most recently, she's developed a health needs assessment framework designed to ensure that community-focused, needs-led approaches aren't overtaken by police agendas, supporting better service provision, tackling exploitation, and safeguarding vulnerable populations. Her voice is both professional and deeply personal. Janine advocates for generative and transformative approaches for children and young people who have faced adversity and violence. Her work has been published by the Research in Practice Network, exploring the impact of childhood violence through creative methods, and by the Contextual Safeguarding Network for her innovative approaches to community safety. This is a conversation about survival, but also about what comes next, about how someone can take their most difficult experiences and turn them into a driving force for change. And it's a reminder that the systems we build are only as strong as the voices we choose to hear. Can you tell us a little bit about what your childhood was like growing up in Northern Ireland?
I would describe it as intense and somewhat unsettling. And I think that really is down to the unfortunate realities that that's what Northern Ireland was like at the time. And I even remember being in a crowd in Belfast, and this was at a time when John Major was actually visiting, and he actually shook my hand. We were standing in a crowd, and he came over to meet people, and he unexpectedly shook my hand. And I would have been 5 years old at the time. And his visit was because of the T-Bane Cross massacre that took place that ended up, I think 7 people were killed in that in 1992. And obviously 6 years later, that would have been the signing of the Good Friday Agreement. So you can appreciate the link between high levels of stress, mental health challenges, and adverse outcomes linked to the Troubles in Northern Ireland. Too many young lives were caught in the crossfire. And Northern Ireland obviously still deals with a lot of troubles today, especially paramilitary activity. So I didn't live in what would be considered a particularly great period of time, and I didn't live in a community that was, I wouldn't, you don't want to stigmatize a community, but it wasn't known to be a particularly great area. It wasn't all bad, but I think the main issue that I picked up on when I was quite little was that there was separations amongst people for sure, if you were Catholic or Protestant. So you only spoke to certain families. I had friends in the area, sure, but not as many as I would have liked. Thankfully, our next door neighbour was really close to us and we got on well with their children and we were allowed to play with them. And they ended up becoming lifelong friends as well. So it was just like having another mother let in next door, a typical caring Irish grandmother, essentially. And it was like that with my primary school as well. It was very strict there. So Northern Ireland is, where I'm from originally, and I'll always have a deep connection to it. Been back over many times. Not the community that I left. I've not been back there, but I've certainly been back across to give talks at the Queen's University Belfast, and I've also done some work over there. So I plan to continue to go back. But I'm always immensely impressed with how resilient the communities are, and they really do deserve our respect for everything that they've been through. But yeah, anyone in growing up in that era probably would have felt really on edge, and that because of what was occurring at the time. So yeah, that's how I would sort of summarize my childhood in Northern Ireland.
Thank you. So, obviously, you mentioned, given the time period, the kind of social and political unrest.
Mhm.
How did you feel in your home?
Well, that was definitely a different story. I think growing up, not every single minute was bad, but most of our family life was extremely difficult. It was the sense of wondering when there would be another outburst, and also seeing the struggle that my mom experienced with that. You were afraid to say the wrong thing or behave in a certain way, otherwise he would get angry. So it was that point that I made about just feeling quite unsettled. It wasn't a safe, loving home living there, it was more survival than anything else. So I grew up having to be on guard and often to expect the worst. There was a number of times that we had to prepare to run out of the house or put the bed up against the door when he was having a violent outburst. And mom would run up the stairs and grab me and my brother and, yeah, put the bed against the door and just pray that things would calm down. There was also many times that my mom and me and my brother would run out to the telephone box as well. And yeah, lots of tears were had. My mom did her best to keep us safe, and she went without in so many ways to make sure that me and my brother were okay, especially with meals, because she often didn't feed herself, so she often went without to make sure that both me and my brother were well fed. Any money that was given to my mom to help us was just immediately taken off of her, and my grandparents tried to send clothes and money and things and trying to maintain contact with my mum, but he just took everything. And he also sold her belongings. So it was really quite, it's quite sad. Like we had very little. Me and my brother were not like very wanty kids. Like we weren't really like that. But it doesn't excuse him doing that anyways, because essentially my mom lost a lot of sentimental items, just pieces of family jewelry. Nothing like special or anything, but it would have been pieces that would have been given to her by her own grandmother, and she would have lost all of that. And it just makes me think actually, I don't actually have anything really from my childhood. We have a few photographs and things, but I don't have any sort of childhood toys or anything from that time period. But it's like I said to you before, we really didn't have that much. The sad reality about it is that everyone on our street could hear what was going on as well, because my father took my mom out onto the streets to be violent to her, and sometimes that would happen in the middle of the night. That's how much he didn't really care about his actions. He didn't care if the world knew that what he was doing, and he certainly did not care about the impact that this would have on me and my brother, who like we both saw everything that was going on. The best times that I probably had right in our back garden, when we were playing with the neighbors' children, and it felt like that we had that extended family with them. I also liked it whenever we could go out of the house, especially any trips to Belfast. But I think now looking back, I realised there was probably a reason for that, about wanting to be outside a lot more, not wanting to go back into the house. So yeah, that was always a thing. Like my mum had great difficulty getting me to go back into the house. But yeah, I think there was a particular reason for that. But it also, I think it puts into perspective, why young people do gravitate towards the street, when we think about young people, and going into the outside world and wanting to hang with friends on the street or whatever because they've got situations going on at home. Young people take a lot of their pain outside, and yeah, it just puts a lot into perspective. But I think like there was also problems with like going to nursery and primary, as well. That was really hard on me, probably the toughest, because I never wanted mom to leave me because I wanted to be by her side. There was like major attachment issues. I had major attachment issues to my mom, and I feel bad about it now because I can appreciate how challenging my behavior had been at the time. But because I didn't want her to be on her own with him, I would just kick up massively. I met with both like being in nursery and also primary school. So there had been occasions where the class teacher would be like, "You really do need to stay here because, Janine's too upset right now." So my mom would sit in the corner or we would play with some of the toys and stuff. And then she would, when I wasn't looking at her or wasn't paying attention, she would quickly run out of the classroom and the teachers would be holding me back, essentially, because I would obviously try and chase after her. But it did take quite a bit of time for me to get settled, and yeah, it was unpleasant. It's sad to know how unsettled my class must have been as well, especially because they wouldn't have had any understanding of why I was getting so upset at the time. And the teachers were not aware of the domestic abuse that was going on either, because obviously my mum wouldn't have wanted to say, which I can understand, but it makes it difficult because obviously the teachers would just be thinking, oh, Janine's just acting up unnecessarily, when in fact there was a reason for it. I just wanted to be very close to my mom during those periods of time. And she ended up, whenever there was school trips or anything, I would always nominate my mom to come on the school trips. And, you know, we laugh about it now. You try and make some, you know, humor from pretty bad situations, and she would say, "Oh, I can't believe I went on all those school trips with you and you nominated me all the time." But again, that was another tactic of mine of keeping her close to me and just us doing stuff together. And she ended up coming to every single school trip. And I think that's what I really love about her the most, is that she'd always do everything possible to make sure that we were going to be okay and we were happy. So attending all of these school trips, because I wanted her there, she did that. And, I'm grateful to her for that. So I think like family life as a child, probably unsafe and pretty traumatic. And there was a lot of violence and there was a lot of being in constant fear of what was going to happen next.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think it's heartbreaking to think about you saying, even at the age of nursery, having the awareness and knowing you have to protect your mum. Like,
Yeah,
that's something that no child should have to even consider, never mind act upon.
yeah.
You did mention how your father would take her out into the street. So obviously, people must have been aware,
Hmm.
and your mother not wanting to talk about it with the teachers or nursery staff.
Hmm.
Did anyone stand in or offer help, whether a professional, a service?
No one came out, but some of the encounters with the police did come as a result of hearing screams and stuff. So sometimes my neighbour would be involved in that, but sometimes there would be calls, but nobody came out. I think the problem is that everybody knew that my father was he was a troublemaker, and he was well known for it, and he was known for his violence. He came from a military background. So I think there was a lot of fear, and also because I think the link between dividedness amongst the community, there was families that wouldn't speak to us. So I suppose that created a lot of isolation in lots of ways, of who would be willing to like help us in that situation like that. But nobody came out because I think people were just so afraid of him, because it was well known what he was obviously doing. My neighbor wasn't afraid to say anything to him. She was very protective over us. But yeah, ultimately, there wasn't much done about it. And it's quite horrific, really, when you think about it, the fact that he would take his violence out onto the street and drag my mom out and really not care if anybody ever heard what was going on.
Yeah, completely. You mentioned police coming quite often from calls of screaming. How
hmm
did you feel about when they came or their response? Were they able to help at all?
I mean, this is really difficult. There was definitely a lot of safeguarding failures and poor responses, but I think probably a couple of occasions it was okay. I mean, I think I would have been about 4 or 5 when I first had my encounter with the police directly in terms of domestic abuse. And then seeing a lot of policing was a frequent occurrence for obvious reasons. And the PSNI were called many times, mainly because of my father when he had like more violent episodes. And there was times that he did get picked up by the police. He had a massive drink problem, which didn't help the situation. So there were a number of times that the police would actually end up picking him up and bringing him back home, or he would end up going into the police car and he'd be taken away and into custody for the night. So before, not just directly domestic abuse, but because of his behaviour in general, he would be somebody that would be frequently picked up by the police. So yeah, there would be numerous times that he'd be taken to the station for questioning, and within a matter of hours that he'd be back home. So I wouldn't just say that they did any welfare asking of us, in general, like what is the home environment going on? Is this just him being a terrible drunk and being a nuisance outside, or is there any situations going on at home? So there wasn't really too much of that at the beginning. But there had been times that they did come out when they did get the call that there was a concern for us. And it was generally just my father answering the door and him trying to give the impression that everything was okay. My mom was very much in the background. Obviously, she was afraid. She wouldn't have said anything at that point in time. But they very much took that at face value, which really was a mistake, and didn't really do much following up after that. But I think probably the worst out of all of them probably would have been the times that we were running out of the house to go next door to our neighbour's house. And there was one time in particular that the PSNI arrived and they advised my mom to go back into the house to calm the situation down. And I still remember the reactions to this day, and it was just this look on their face that this was like a nuisance call to them, basically. So it was really disappointing. And they had said to my mom, look, it's late at night. Any chance that you could go back next door and try and calm the situation down with him? We were all like looking at each other. And I think my mom felt pressured into that as a solution. She was vulnerable at the time. And I think she probably got the impression that the police were just not really taking it as seriously as they should be, because I don't think that's an appropriate response at all to say to somebody, oh, it's late at night. So why do we not just sort this out and you go back next door and try and calm him down? So we all went to the neighbour's door and we were standing there. The police were behind us. And then my mum started walking down the garden path and going back into the house. And me and my brother just started screaming, which was pretty traumatic. And we were crying because we could see that she was afraid to go back into the house. So me and my brother we attempted to run after her, but the police ended up holding us back and restraining us. So that's not something that you forget easily. And certainly a lot of my own professional work, a lot of my work is dealing with controversial policing practices against vulnerable people. And I've also done a lot of work in sort of domestic abuse. I did go back to Northern Ireland and, I did explain to the PSNI what had happened and did some work in Scotland as well, where I'm based currently. But yeah, I mean, it just is quite the thing that it wouldn't have been good anyways because we wouldn't have wanted her to go back into the house. But you can imagine two young people, that their mums experience violence, and the solution to that is to expect her to go back into the house by herself to calm the situation down. It wasn't as if that she had anybody with her. The police did not walk back with her into the house. So it was awful. It was really bad. It was one of those incidents that I think you just would never forget, and I never did. It didn't turn me into an angry person because I wanted to try and put pain into purpose, I suppose. But I think obviously that was always going to be a starting point for me, or to really be concerned about people's experiences with the criminal justice system and policing, because really, like, that was a major mistake to do that. It was very traumatic for me and my brother. And, being physically pulled back by the police as well, being young kids at the time, it really was diabolical. That was quite possibly one of the worst incidents. But the only good thing that the police did was that when my mum had made a plan about our escape, we basically had help from a neighbour to leave. My father was out at this point in time, and we actually went to the neighbour's house for the night. And I think my mom and the neighbour spoke to the police and said, look, we're leaving, we can't do this anymore. It just got into a point that my mom really just couldn't tolerate it anymore, because it had been going on for 10 years, and he wasn't going to change. And my brother was saying to my mom, we need to leave, can't stay here anymore. And I wasn't particularly well at the time. I had really bad asthma as a child, and I had frequent visits in hospital. And my father was a smoker, and he would blow cigarette smoke in my face. He was just a really nasty man like that. So I think it just got to a point that, my mom was like, we have to leave. So we got the police, a whole heap of them, to come over to our house. My father was back in the house at the time, and he was told basically to sit in the chair. There was probably about several police officers there. I would say probably about 7 or 8 that were crowded around him in the living room. And we didn't have much, but we went to collect a few items that we had left, the most important things. And we ended up leaving. And then the following night, that was when we went on a boat and got on the ferry, came over to Scotland. And then afterwards, we were put into a women's refuge for 2 years. So, yeah, the only good thing about the policing then was the fact that there was a good number of them there that made a point of saying, you're not moving anywhere, you stay there. And, that was definitely what I experienced to be helpful. But that probably was the only only time that the police helped. And there was so many times over like a 10-year period that they were called out. So it puts a lot into perspective just how much, we were failed.
As much as it's kind for you to say that they were good at that final point, there's 10 years of just failure after failure for a
Exactly. Yeah.
vulnerable woman and 2 vulnerable children. So you made it to Scotland. How did things start to change?
We had good experiences. Living in a refuge, people will have different experiences with that. Some people have good experiences, and other people, they don't have easy situations. And unfortunately, when you're living with people that you don't know, it's a close living environment with other families. But we were really lucky. Essentially, it was an old hospital that had been converted into little apartments. So I think there were probably about 8 of them. And this was in a rural part as well, in a tiny community. And it worked well. There are obviously different experiences, and there's new research coming out now about domestic abuse in rural areas, and, the good sides of that and the bad sides. But it worked well for us. The community knew about the refuge, and they were really respectful about it. The little convenience store that we would go into, if they saw a new face, I think they would always sort of guess the reason for that, especially if it's a woman with children. So I remember the first time going into the store, and the couple that owned the place were just really sweet with me and my brother, and they had a smile on their face, and they would be like, oh, do you live around the corner? And we'd be like, yeah. And they gave us sweeties as well, just trying to like very much create a very like welcoming and comfortable environment for us, which I really appreciated. So we didn't have much, but we were just so grateful for what we had. It was, basic living, but that's what you need at the time. And it's not really about the material stuff. It's about being in a safe home. And being in the refuge was just so, believe it or not, relaxing for me. And it prevented that feeling of isolation because being with other women and children, it was, a reminder that this happens to so many people. And it's not good that anybody's there, but it is good that women and children are there to try and be safe and maybe perhaps start healing and recovery. So I could see that my mum benefited massively from being in that space because she was obviously speaking to other women, and I enjoyed seeing her being able to feel a bit more relaxed because so much of my childhood I saw my mom in quite a lot of distress. So when I saw her chatting with the other women, it meant a lot to me. And I really enjoyed it because I met other children there and I'd made friends there, and we had a nice play area outside. Really, really nice. Somebody donated a couple of bikes and we would go out and play, and just that huge sense of safety for us. I can't tell you just how much of an amazing feeling that was to just be at home, not have to worry about leaving, or, sometimes my brother would sleep with his socks and shoes on. Just if things got really bad, he would help to take care of me and take me out the house. And he didn't have to do that anymore. He was a couple of years older than me. So yeah, Greg, my brother, he really helped my mum to look after me. But the fact that we didn't have to do that anymore. But there was maybe a couple of issues with the refuge when women who had been in contact with their partners a couple of times that we were ended up being in lockdown because they had disclosed where we were. So that was the only drawback about that. And I suppose being in a rural area, that was one of the things. But there was also another situation that maybe perhaps wasn't good. It was more to do with confidentiality because essentially our information was leaked about our whereabouts. So my father had been in contact with a men's support organisation in Northern Ireland. And what they had done is that they'd contacted Women's Aid here, where I am in Scotland currently. He suspected we might be in this specific place because my mum had particular connections to this area. So these representatives professed to Women's Aid that my father was very sorry for his actions. I mean, how many hundreds of times did he say that to my mother over 10 years? They had said, "Oh, he's put some money in a letter for you all," and they basically asked if they could send the letter over, and Women's Aid had said yes. So, big problem there because that gave the green light where we actually were. And yeah, we did find out that he did come to Scotland when he wasn't allowed to be anywhere near us. The court case against my father didn't amount to a custodial sentence, which I think you can imagine is horrendous because that's 10 years of violence and abuse not recognised for what should have been. But he wasn't allowed to be in, I think it was within a 60-mile radius of us, of where we were. But of course, that didn't stop him from trying his luck. We found out that it was 3 times that he came over. So it's a major reality check when men don't give up, and how, unfortunately, when people talk about the fact that it's not always easy for women to leave, and it can still be a situation of like you're not always going to be in a safe position even when you do leave. I think that's clear there, and perpetrators not giving up. So the last time that we found out that he had come over was in my 20s. So really puts into perspective the length of time that he didn't give up. So my mom didn't really ever get any sense of peace in our life until we found out that he had died several years ago. And when we found out he died, I remember she burst into tears. And I knew that she would be emotional, but she just said every night I'd worried about him finding us and turning up at the door. And that really cut me because I can't imagine what it's like to just always be in fear that he's still out there. He's been trying to get in contact. He's been trying to look for us. It would be hard to switch off from, but I think it showed the length of time that my mom had really been in fear. So, yeah, what you were saying about what it was like after Northern Ireland, I suppose in lots of ways it was good because of the sense of safety, but again, the safety became compromised. And also, I think my mom never really got that sense of being completely safe because of obviously what had happened, and only feeling safe when he'd actually died. So I felt really bad that she never spoke about that. She always tried her best to, give the impression that, we're starting a new life and it's all going to be okay. But I think that was more for me and my brother's sake more than anything else. I think that she had been in quite a lot of worry for some time. So Women's Aid learned a harsh lesson from that. I do know it was a mistake. I mean, back then, everyone at that period of time was still learning how to deal with domestic abuse. And, you know, men are very manipulative when it comes to being violent and abusive. And these are just all learning points, I suppose, and learning points how best to protect and safeguard as much as possible. So I never held a grudge about that. They probably thought at the time, yeah, she deserves to read this letter because he should be apologetic. But at the same time, they just did not realize that it was just a tactic to try and find out where we were. So there's lots to learn from situations like this. And I think at the time, social work, women's aid, support workers, police, when I discussed some of these situations, they did find it to be really helpful, but obviously they were pretty mortified by it, about everything that can essentially go wrong.
How did you find your way into working in criminal justice issues yourself? Obviously, I guess a huge part of that is you have the lived experience, but what kind of begun that process for you?
I became very curious to know like how many other people are experiencing these situations, and obviously millions upon millions of people are. But I think that was it for me. It wasn't essentially just to go out there and say this is what happened to me, because I always make sure that I make people aware that I'm not representative of everybody's experience. I can only highlight things that have happened to us in order that it can improve practice as much as possible. But I think the experience, I was like, my goodness, who else out there is having these bad experiences? So I've got 2 decades of work in terms of like victim support, public health, reducing harm for young people, reducing harm for people who would be considered more vulnerable that don't access services and don't report instances of violence and exploitation because of the criminal justice system because they have experienced violence. I've definitely worked with people that have experienced violence by the police as well. So that was it. It was the curiosity. And I definitely think that living in a women's refuge and living amongst different people and learning about different people and their experiences, I enjoyed listening to people. And I think that's the thing about me, is that I am very good with people, in the sense that I think people know with me that I'm authentic, they trust me, and I'm not afraid to address bad practices. And I think that's it as well. I've had many situations where I've had difficult conversations about failures. So I would always consider myself a bit of an activist, but also an advocate as well for people that have lost a lot of faith in the criminal justice system, which I do understand. So yeah, I think the knowing what we had gone through, wondering who else is out there who's having those similar experiences, and also being in a women's refuge probably was always going to be a motivation for going into these sorts of areas of work.
What would you say your role in advocacy, justice work, and activism has played in your personal healing?
I think it really has helped me so much, and even doing this podcast with you, it does help. I think the healing factor is, it's horrible that so many people are having these experiences, but I think being able to write, I've done well now in terms of my education, but I had major problems with my learning at the beginning, and I didn't have a particularly great period of school, and it still upsets me because I think there's a sense of grief when you think, what would I have been like if I hadn't gone through that experience? Because I think even though I enjoy all my work, I think we all know that probably having the happy family life is probably what everybody really wants. But I didn't have a particularly great time with my education. I had delayed learning, I suppose, because of the trauma and because of being moved around a few times as well. And I found it really difficult to catch up with schoolwork and things like that. So I'd really struggled with my education. So the learning, the writing, improving my communication, you know, massive healing factor for me. And I love writing, I love reading, and I love being able to write about issues to do with the criminal justice system. I've got a couple of pieces that are going to be coming out shortly, one with the British Society of Criminology, and that's a criminal justice piece that I wrote. So there is a healing element to it. And I think I just like community and I like connecting with other people as well, because you need that. You need community. There's so many of my friends that have come from similar backgrounds to me that have gone on and done amazing things. You know, there's lots of my friends that have got their PhDs and talking and teaching students and, you know, creating safer spaces. I've got a friend who's doing a lot of work on addressing trauma informed, because there's a lot of people that have gone to trauma informed support and not had that a good experience. I mean, there's a lot more people nowadays that are saying, well, I'm actually very sick of trauma informed. What's beyond that? And you know, I think that's the sad reality, is that some people are re-traumatized, even when there are people and organizations and stuff that say, oh, we're trauma informed, when actually there's a lot of bad and unethical practices that are going on. I've enjoyed a lot of the things that I've done, but I think at the beginning, I don't think necessarily I always got credit for some of the stuff that I did do. And I participated in several studies on childhood domestic abuse and policing and family violence and so forth. And I didn't get any credit for it. Not that I was participating in it for credit, it was really to just build knowledge. And it was useful for me because I've done research before, and I think it was really good to have that experience of going through sort of interviewing and creative methods to understand the power that lies behind them. But I think the point is that, yeah, just a lot of the work that I'm involved with, as well as I don't like extraction and I don't like exploitation. And I think sometimes with lived experience, that's been a bit of a problem, because I think then people didn't really know how to support people with lived experience. You know, a lot of the time it was a case people would go and give a talk and might be given a box of chocolates or something, which, you know, is not meaningful involvement. I've enjoyed a lot of the work that I do, and I've got a community of people that I really respect. There's people that I'm in touch with just now, and we're talking about writing book chapters on child first policing and all sorts of things to do with safeguarding. So it's made a huge difference to me. But at the same time, I really would have liked to have not gone through this experience. And I think I can relate to what people do say out there. Like, you know, my trauma didn't make me resilient. I went through tremendous hardship with it. And I think that I can understand that as well.
Thank you for sharing that. Your work is incredibly important, and I think everyone's so grateful for the work that you do now. If you could redesign how the justice system responds to domestic abuse, especially when children are involved, what do you think that might look like?
Well, thinking about some of the failings with the court system, domestic abuse, and public perception of domestic abuse, I think the biggest failing that I see right now is that we just do not have this pristine frontline response to domestic abuse, and there's no point in trying to cover it up. And I think sometimes when organisations become too close with the police, there's always this kind of, I'm not saying cover up, but they want to give this sort of perception that, you know, police are taking violence against women seriously. Yes, that might be the case. But at the same time, we need to know the realities. We need to know about these experiences of when failings are happening and when the police do not understand what's going on. And we can see that in recent high profile cases, that there's just a lack of understanding still, and it's obvious that we have to keep a close eye on that. We might have legislation and we might have policy commitments, but it won't mean anything unless we're delivering on the ground. So this doesn't mean all responses are failing, but certainly there are failures, and we need to make sure we highlight those, because really it's a matter of life or death. And I think we both know I'm not exaggerating when I say that, you know, it might sound terrifying, but that is where we stand with violence against women. I think the biggest thing for me right now is the court system just scares me, especially the situation of the family courts and the men abusing the system to control over their partners and potentially, obviously, inflict harm on children and young people. You know, women go through the criminal justice system because they want to protect their children. And when they raise concerns, they're made to feel like they're being unnecessarily difficult and not thinking about what's best for their child, but they are. Cases are heard in private, decisions vary widely between judges, and survivors of abuse are often re traumatized in the process of trying to protect themselves and their kids. Look at my own situation. We were failed in that. He didn't receive a custodial sentence, but even when it was instructed that he come nowhere near us, he still did. The family court system can enable the extension of that, and it ignores the severity of serious safeguarding concerns, not to mention ignoring the welfare needs of children. So that's really like a huge thing for me. If both me and my brother had been told by the courts that we had to go back to Northern Ireland to live with my father, I don't know how I would have coped with that. We might not even have been here today. The family lawyer essentially interviewed both me and my brother, and we gave a testimony about what my mom had been going through because he wanted to hear it from us ourselves, and obviously for the court case. We knew that he was never going to change, and me and my brother could never forgive what he had done. And it upsets me to think about how many children or young people are sent back to live with their abusive fathers. And we know that can result in death as well. Like, we see this all the time in cases in the media where children and young people have been failed because the mothers haven't been listened to. And also, you just wonder what social work and all these other multidisciplinary teams are actually talking about when it comes to children's safety. I just hope, really, in some ways, what I'm saying just now can just be this massive wake up call with thousands of others who are saying the same thing, especially when it comes to family courts. Like, radical action and reform are needed now. There's no way that we can wait any longer. In terms of child domestic abuse, I still think the issue for me right now is that there just still seems to be a huge battle with early support in place. We have to really make sure that we've got mental health and all these types of support as early as possible to make sure that children and young people really do have a better chance. I wouldn't want any of them to have to navigate problems early like I did. We see all the time that there's so much struggle, and it's devastating, really. It's just not good enough. We need to think about as well, when a child comes from a violent home, the consequences are far reaching. And when we look at youth violence as well, it's not really about young people carrying knives. A lot of the time, it's being in fear and experiencing pain, having come from a background of a violent home. So there's lots of people just now, like Dr. Jade Lavelle. She's a friend of mine, and she's doing work on childhood domestic abuse and serious youth violence. And her PhD project, she was doing creative methods with ex-gang members, and so much of them had such a painful story to tell. And a lot of these guys, when you hear their stories, they've never been given any support, and they've just been expected to kind of carry on with the situation, man up kind of thing, and kind of deal with it. But it breaks my heart. And Jade was really able to use music elicitation as a way of having something that kind of gave ownership back to them, so that they were able to express their feelings and how they felt about their childhood through music. So really powerful stuff. I personally have benefited from creative methods. I have written a couple of pieces about my experiences with being a participant in studies, and really like advocate for creative methods because it's so powerful, the amount of information, and it's a very like soothing experience as well. So these sorts of methodologies and thinking about young people, their development, these are all really important things when it comes to childhood domestic abuse. I think from my point of view, I don't want anybody out there ever roaming around life and not feeling as though they were not properly cared about. Life's already extremely tough, and you know that yourself. So if you're being put in a marginalized state on top of all these multiple inequalities that exist in society, and you're holding on to so much pain from the violence that you've experienced being in a violent home, it's a really unbearable experience for a young person.
Absolutely. And then, based on what you've just said, do you have a message maybe that you'd want to share with other survivors, especially those still trying to be believed or even find safety?
I think the key message is that, you're never alone. And I know that sounds maybe not the best message, but it's easy to fall back when you're dealing with so much and you're a survivor or you're still surviving. There can be periods of when you just feel isolated and you still feel quite alone in your pain. And ultimately, like, you're not alone. And I think the more that we stick together and we keep continuing to raise concerns, talk about failures, we're just going to have to, keep going with that and doing the best that we can. So, yeah, I think the key message is that you're not alone. There is a community of people out there, including myself. I'm always available to speak to, and I do want to continue doing more work in this area. So, always happy to hear from people. I'm very contactable. So, yeah, just you're not alone. And that's the best, well, probably the key message for me.
I want to thank Janine for her openness, her honesty, and the generosity it takes to share a story like this. It's not easy to revisit painful memories, but by doing so, she's helping to shine a light on the gaps in our system and showing what's possible when those with lived experience lead the way. If you'd like to read more of her work, we've linked her articles in the show notes, including her reflections on the impact of childhood violence, her research into how young people see safety and harm, and her advice for those working in policing and vulnerability. I hope you take the time to explore them. They're a powerful extension of the conversation that you've just heard. And if you, or someone you know, is living with domestic abuse, please remember, help is out there, and you do not have to go through it alone. We've included details of support services in the show notes. You've been listening to Rebel Justice. If you'd like to support our work and receive 4 digital editions and 1 print issue a year, subscribe to The View for just £20. Make sure to follow us on our social media. We're on Instagram at the_view_magazines, and you can also find us on LinkedIn, X, and TikTok. If you'd like to reach out to us directly, you can email inquiries to us at press@theviewmagazine.org. Please share this story.